Welcome to week 4. So this week we're going to be talking about energy flow through ecosystems. Obviously we would not have life without energy, and nothing in the world can create it. So we got to steal it. And we get all of our energy through the sun. This lecture is going to discuss, we're going to discuss the basics of what I think you need to know about how ecosystems work, and then we can build on this. And so when we talk about conservation, you'll have some idea of how things work. So first thing you need to realize is all the 7 billion people on Earth, all the animals on Earth, we don't have any energy unless there's plants. Plants don't have any energy unless there's sunlight. So when I say we steal our energy, essentially every calorie you eat originally came from the sun. I don't care if you're an herbivore, I don't care if you're a vegetarian, I don't care if you're a strict meat eater. Every calorie you put in your body came from the sun. How plants get that is with a mixture of nutrients and water and light. They produce glucose, which is what the original energy that fuels us all. Whether we certainly need proteins, but the original molecule of energy is glucose that's produced by photosynthesis. No, you don't have to memorize the steps of photosynthesis, but you need to know that the sun drives all of our system. So you have this magnificent elk here. He's a consumer. He can stand in the sun forever, and unless people bring him bales of hay, he won't survive. But these plants around him, they can sit in the sun, and as long as they have water and nutrients in the soil, they're fine. They don't need anybody to bring them anything, and which is a good thing for him because he can't produce any energy on his own. He eats the grass. He gets the energy that's in the grass, plus he gets the nutrients in the grass. And so he's able to survive and build this big, magnificent 700-pound body. Now, the sun actually captures, plants only capture a minor portion of the energy that comes from the sun. So all the light energy that hits the earth, plants at most get about 4% of that. So 96% of the sunlight that hits the earth every day goes unused by life. But the amount of energy they produce is unbelievable. For example, a grassland, an acre of grass, can produce 9 million calories per acre in the form of sugar over a 10-hour day. 9 million calories. Again, that's 4%. It's estimated that in the earth every year, 270 billion tons of plants are produced, grow. 270 billion tons. The amount of energy that's needed to create 207 billion tons, 70, is the same as 100 million terawatts. Now, when I was doing some research, I didn't really know what a terawatt was. I'm not an electricity guy, but it's beyond most of us our imagination. 100 million terawatts is essentially all the energy needed to do everything humans need 6 times in a year. So the amount of energy contained in plants that grow each year has the same amount of energy that whether it goes in an airplane, whether it goes in a car, whether it turns on our light, whatever it does, it's 6 times more energy than we would even use. So if we get as efficient at harnessing sun's energy as plants, our problems are solved. And Solar energy is great, but we are way behind plants. Nature has been around for millions of years and has learned how to harness energy much better than we have. But I do have faith in technology. Actually, this slide is kind of optimistic to me. So now, obviously the amount of sun is going to control a plant, but moisture is key. The amount of moisture is absolutely essential for photosynthesis to occur. Also nutrient availability. Temperature, this is the Arctic tundra. It's so cold there, plants can't grow 9 to 10 months out of the year, whereas this is a desert grassland in southeastern Arizona. It can grow almost all year, so it has a long growing season. How much animals utilize or graze on the plants can determine the amount of productivity. You might think that's all negative, but a lot of plants grow faster and more if they're grazed, and that's a adaptation they've evolved over the years to grazing. Fire certainly can reduce the amount of production that's been grown that year, but returning all those nutrients to the soil can actually make plants grow faster. And because of these factors, we look at this grassland. If there's no rain, it could be 800% less productivity than if there is a lot of rain. So it varies each year. And just to give you an example, here in Arizona, I did a study on pronghorn, and in our state, our pronghorn are reducing, and the primary reason is these little guys. This is a fawn. He'd just been born that day, and I was able to sneak up and take a picture. Unfortunately, in some herds, we're losing 80-90% of our fawns each year, and that population obviously is declining. You can't have that low of recruitment and have a population. So we started to look at potential factors affecting fawn survival, because the reason these fawns are dying is because they're ending up in the jaws of these guys, coyotes. And ecologically, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense that they eat that many, because these two species evolved together for hundreds of thousands of years. They've both been on Earth. The same, well, pronghorn have been around longer than coyotes, but they've been around a long time. And today, to get pronghorn populations back up, hunters or Game and Fish itself actually shoots coyotes right before the fawns are born, which helps recruitment. More fawns survive. Once they get to about this age, 2 months old, they can outrun a coyote, and the danger is no more there. It's really that first 4 weeks of life. So what has happened, we thought, what has happened to make everything out of balance? Why is this predator essentially, possibly, wiping out this prey item? Because that probably wouldn't happen very often historically. So we looked at several factors. Nutrition, obviously, could affect them. Predation. This is key, the amount of cover for hiding fawns. We even looked at water source pollutants, we looked at number of trees, and we looked at fencing, which restricts pronghorn's movements. But this is what we're really looking at. If look right here, you can see the fawn lying down, and that's what they do for the first 3 weeks of life. Mom will just somehow tell them to lie there. They will not move. I'm about 10 feet from that fawn. That fawn is not going to move. Matter of fact, to collar them, we just run up to them, grab them in their first week of life, and they still would just sit there, put a radio collar on, lay them right back down. Well, notice that there's no grass covering this youngster. Probably the main reason why there's no grass is cattle grazing. So we assumed that, hey, cattle are eating all the cover, makes it easier for coyotes to find them, and that's our smoking gun. So if we remove cattle from the ecosystem, then we won't have pronghorn fawns surviving. But we did all that study for 4 years, and we looked at everything. I mean, we looked at 8 different factors, and I took all the data from those 8 factors, and I tried to come up with something meaningful, and nothing made sense. Number of predators didn't seem to affect pronghorn fawn survival. The amount of cover didn't seem to affect prawn survival. But when I started collecting weather data, I started figuring out what was going on. And if we don't get 4 inches of winter rain, our fawns aren't going to survive. Now, does that have something to do with the amount of grass cover? Absolutely. But more importantly, during the winter, when the fawns are developing inside the pronghorn mom, those plants are growing, and if they get more water, they'll grow more, and they'll have more nutrition in them, and the mom will be better in nutritional shape, and the mom will be able to produce a higher quality milk, and we think that's the key. And I don't know how you do anything about that. We can do rain nets as all we want, and it's never been found to work too well. There's still certainly, some things we can do, but anyway, rain affecting plant growth affects things that we didn't realize how important it was. So, the most productive environments on Earth, where the most energy is produced: coral reefs, tropical rainforests, and saltwater marshes. Now, most of us probably don't think about saltwater marshes. Unfortunately, we've covered most of them up to build hotels along the coast. But the amount of a grass called spartina that grows tons and tons and tons per acre. So it's a very productive environment. We start looking at production, the amount of growth, the amount of calories produced in Arizona. We've got a lot of sunlight, but we don't have much rain. So here in the upper Sonoran, which is on the east side of town, this is probably about 10 miles from my house, near the Superstitions, gets probably twice the rainfall as the desert down by Yuma, and you can see the difference. Add more water, plants can do more photosynthesis, more growth, more energy for the animals in the ecosystem. We look around the state, grasslands and higher elevations do better than lower elevations. Forests, obviously there's a lot. It takes 15 inches of rain a year for a ponderosa pine forest to grow. So the more rainfall, the greater amount of plant biomass. The gentlemen here, they're smiling, but it's only because of the picture. This is how scientists, and I've done this millions of times, hundreds, we actually take a plot and then we go along and clip everything that's available to the animal, and that's how we determine production. We go back, we dry it, we weigh it, and we compare area A with area B, and we know which one is more productive. I made the comment about them smiling. It's probably the most boring thing I did in my career. So now I've been talking about animals that eat plants, and they are called consumers. So scientists put them in different levels: primary consumer, which are herbivores; secondary consumers, which are carnivores, coyotes, prey, other herbivores, other animals. There's also tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers, then it goes to parasites and detritus feeders and decomposers, which I'll discuss here in just a bit, which are the bacteria and fungi which break down the dead animal or the feces from that animal and return that nutrient to the soil. So we have what's called trophic categories. Plants, they're either called producers or autotrophs. You should be, when you do your quiz or your test here at the end of this unit, you'll be looking on some of the questions. You'll be looking for those two answers. So anything that's a photosynthetic green plant, a photosynthetic bacteria, chemosynthetic bacteria, which are down at the bottom of the earth, ocean, all produce their own energy. And then you have the heterotrophs, which must feed on organic matter for energy, which are also called consumers. You have herbivores, you have omnivores, which I didn't mention on the last slide, which are animals that eat both vegetation and meat. A coyote, believe it or not, coyotes eat a lot of vegetation, so they're considered an omnivore. Bears in Arizona eat 96% vegetation, whereas in Alaska they eat 90% meat. So it really depends on where the organism lives. Any cats don't eat vegetation. They just don't do it. They're secondary consumers. They are predators. They're only going to eat meat. And then you can keep going up. And then you have, again, this detritus feeders or decomposers, which you may have never heard of before. And that's the things that break down fecal material or dead organisms. So here you have mushrooms and a number of earthworms, soil fungi, all these little microorganisms that are breaking down this dead log. And they're slowly returning those nutrients that tree took out of the ground back into the system. And that's really key. Because remember, back to photosynthesis, the plants need water, light, and nutrients. They need nitrogen, they need phosphorus. So those go into the system, they go into the organic material, and then when the organic material dies, or, pooped out, these guys return those nutrients to the soil, and they are extremely important. Extremely important. Again, more examples. There's your earthworm. And I don't know if you guys knew, that's a worm. It's a pretty worm. It's called a nudibranch. This is another marine worm. You might see them in aquarium stores called feather dusters. So worms come in all shapes and sizes, so don't get freaked out with worms. Several different kinds of plants or fungi, which is really what a mushroom is. Crabs, mollusks, worms, bacteria, all help return nutrients back into the original system. So if we look at producers, primary consumer is always going to be an herbivore. Secondary consumer is always going to be an omnivore or a carnivore. Third order consumers are certainly going to be a carnivore. So a food chain then, and we build those, I think we build them primarily for teaching, but in this grassland in the Chihuahuan Desert, this animal, which is a kangaroo rat, eats the seeds produced by those grass. So it's not producing its own energy. The grass is, again, producing all the energy. But this little guy is going to take advantage of that production and eat the seeds. Unfortunately, they get caught by coyotes. The coyotes eat the kangaroo rat. They defecate it out. These guys return that energy back into the system. When the coyote dies, these guys will return that nutrients. They don't return the energy. They do return the nutrients. This is just a quick diagram, again, showing producers, primary consumers, and these are animals that will eat them. They're omnivores that could eat both. This guy's got a carrot, corn, and a mouse at the same time. And what that shows a little bit, not quite as much, is a food web. And these are, food chains really aren't that realistic. They happen, but most ecosystems have what's called a food web. So there's a lot of animals that can eat who eats who. And it's a group of interconnected food chains that exist in an ecosystem. So here's an Arctic marine system, which is very complicated. You have the phytoplankton and ice biota, which they are the organisms that with sunlight produce energy. Zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. Here you have herbivorous zooplankton eating the ice biota. Carnivorous zooplankton, those are eaten by small fish or beluga whales or otter cod. Then you start getting into these food webs where you start drawing lines in between who eats who. And depending on the number of animals in the system, you can get a lot of lines drawn. And that actually is positive, because the greater number of organisms that are in the more diverse your food web is, the more stable that ecosystem is. Why? Because if you lose one animal goes through a deep decline because of disease, all different kinds of circumstances that would cause some species decline, all the other species have something else they can eat. So the loss of one or the reduction of one will not throw the whole system off. Now, why do I have a slide of Ireland? Because in Ireland in the 1800s was probably the most simple food chain or food web you could see. Potatoes, people. Unfortunately, you had the potato blight. There's 4 million people living in Ireland. 1.5 million immigrated. They left. They had to, because there was nothing to eat. Over 500,000, maybe more, depending on estimates, died from starvation. So, because potatoes were reduced, the whole system crashed. Going back to the Sonoran Desert, you have a lot of animals that are dependent on several different to survive. If one reduces, the whole system won't crash. On average, and this is key, 10% of the energy moves from one trophic level to the next. So if you have 1,000 calories in a little plot of grass, the most that's going to be absorbed by herbivores is about 100 calories. And each time you move up, energy will be lost. That's due to several different reasons. A lot of it is we're not that efficient at digesting and getting all the energy. We don't eat all the energy that's in one organism. We don't eat the bones of a cow. So a lot of that energy remains, and then we just can't digest it. And it takes a ton of energy to digest stuff. So 90% is lost. And a lot of that goes back to 2 laws in thermodynamics, back to physics. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, but is converted from one form to another. The second law, in any energy conversion, you'll end up with less usable energy than you started with. So every time energy is converted from one form to the other, you lose the amount of energy that was in there. So I like this slide best. I think it does the best job of explaining to this guy. You've got a lot of high potential food in all these different plants. You have a deer. A lot of what that deer, this buck, eats will pass through undigested. It just doesn't have the ability to break down the cellulose and get all the energy that is contained in those plant cells. A lot of it is used during the digestive process. Your metabolism goes way up after you eat. You're burning a lot of calories. Unfortunately, when a guy that's heavy like me, you don't burn near as much as you're able to obtain. And then a small percentage, 10% on average, is assimilated for use in body growth and repair. So 10% each time you go up. So you have producers with 10,000 kilocalories. This slide is wrong. I'm going to go through that. So limitation, because of so little energy being transferred, the first trophic level, the plant, is always going to create the greatest number of organisms or biomass. So you can build these, what they call food pyramids, in ecology textbooks. We don't go out as scientists and build a food pyramid, but it really shows you can expect a much greater amount of biomass of plants than you can herbivores. And you can expect a much greater biomass of herbivores, weight, than you can carnivores, because the energy is lost each time you come up. So you can see that, and it's in most ecosystems. Okay, last slide. Well, next to the last slide. So for an individual that eats 10 pounds of seafood, how many thousands of pounds of plankton are needed just for casual food. And this doesn't include the rest of the world. Predators in the ocean also like seafood. Okay. I do a lot of fishing. I love salmon fishing. I've gone to Alaska. This is my family here with me for years. I used to be an outdoor writer. I need to get back into that. But say, for example, I gain a pound. A pound of this belly here is coming from eating salmon. So if we look at that 10% rule, I need to eat at least 10 pounds of salmon to gain a pound. To get 10 pounds of salmon, on average, you're going to need 100 pounds of herring. You're going to need 1,000 pounds of juvenile fish to produce 100 pounds of adult herring. Juvenile fish need to eat at least 10,000 pounds of that zooplankton that we looked at earlier. 10,000 pounds of larger zooplankton need to eat 100,000 pounds of microzooplankton. And 100,000 pounds of microzooplankton need to eat 1,000,000 pounds of phytoplankton or algae, basically. So my 1 pound of weight gain, because I'm way up the food chain, I am 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm the 6th order consumer, came from 1,111,110 pounds of life. Believe it or not, that is not that far off from really what you would expect. Because you're losing energy each time. 90%, 90%, 90%. Now, is that 90% always happen? No, there's a lot of variation. I don't know that I've introduced rule number 1 to you yet, but in my classes at ASU, I would say there's rule number 1. Rule number 1 is there's an exception to every rule, and that includes rule number 1. So don't expect logically, if you were to go out and build a pyramid, for it to be exactly perfect, 90, 10, 10, 10, so on. There are going to be exceptions. There's going to be variation. This is a table from a vertebrate zoology book, and it shows that ectotherms, which are these reptiles and amphibians, are much more efficient than getting energy and assimilating energy than mammals or birds. And that's because we're endotherms. We are constantly maintaining our body temperature, so while we're digesting, we're using a lot of energy, whereas a hognose snake will swallow a mouse and then it will just chill. They are the king of chill. I am not going to move for a week and a half. I am going to make sure I digest this thing slowly. I'm going to make sure I get every calorie. Obviously, they're not saying that to themselves, but they evolved completely different. There's the fast, high amount of eating versus slow, don't need as many resources. So hopefully I didn't confuse you. It'll be a 10-point quiz based on this lecture. And if there's any questions, please email me. I appreciate it.